This is the Leica Q2 Ghost Edition by Hodinkee. They're only making 2,000 of these, and every time I pick up this camera, I think two thoughts. One, my God, this camera is beautiful. And two, please don't fucking drop it. 4 years ago, this camera was released. 4 years ago, I was shooting on a Fuji X-T3. The idea of shooting on something with a fixed lens seemed rather stupid to me at the time. But fast forward 4 years, I sold that X-T3 and bought a Canon R5, which I then sold and bought a Fuji X100V. And I freaking love this camera. So here we are 4 years later, and now I have two fixed lens cameras. The pleasure I get out of photography has changed somewhat. It used to be just the photo itself, like the end result is what made me happy. But now I would say the process in which I go through to get that photo is as important, if not more important. And when I say process, I don't just mean like how I went about composing the photo. I mean like how I actually interacted with the camera on that day also contributes to those good feelings. Kind of hard to vlog on a C70, but I freaking love the shooting experience on this camera. Like, I enjoy turning knobs and messing with dials and manually focusing this lens. And when it comes to those things, no other camera I've ever owned comes close to this camera from a sensory feedback experience. You really can see and feel the love and care that went into this camera when it was built. Earlier, I mentioned this camera, the X100V, and despite it looking and kind of operating very similarly to the Leica Q2, knobs, dials, retro minimalistic style fixed lens, I don't use it the way I do the Q2, like at all. I shoot in full auto on this camera, full auto white balance, auto ISO, auto shutter, everything auto, you get the drift. But that's not why I bought the camera. I didn't buy the camera to be that sensory feedback experience. I bought it to be fun, tiny, unobtrusive, it doesn't get in the way. Kind of like a social media camera, if I'm being honest, a moderately expensive point and shoot. Why did I get the Leica Q2 then? Because I wanted something that I could interact with. That sensory feedback from me, like adjusting knobs and turning dials, I don't know what that is about me, but that gives me a lot of joy. I also wanted to slow the process down. I wanted to really enjoy the process of taking a photo. Now, I also bought it for the image quality. And this isn't to say you can't print or sell prints from the X100V, but I think because of how I look at that camera, I look at that camera as kind of like just a really fun toy. And so I never take the process of taking that photo seriously enough to justify selling it. However, I do with this camera, and it's something I want to do more of, print my photography, potentially sell my photography if anyone should ever want it. And it's hard to argue with the full frame 47 megapixel sensor in this camera. The images are absolutely bananas. And so they're just better suited for larger prints. Also, this lens is pretty special. 28mm f1.4 Summilux. Like I said, just like manually focusing this lens is an absolute joy. And then it's got a little button on here. You've been seeing me play with that. So it's in manual right now, even if I turn it all the way over, but it's not until I press that button and go like this that it engages autofocus. But also turning it to macro, the aperture ring, all of it is just so nice to use. And in the short while that I've had this, I've already made some of my favorite photos. Yes, they're pretty much entirely of my dog Henry, but nonetheless, I love them. I just got back from LA. I spent the last 3 days there visiting Universal Studios, Long Beach Aquarium, and the LA Zoo. Me and the family went, celebrated a birthday, not mine. It was awesome. What else was awesome is that I got to spend 3 whole days shooting on the Leica Q2, which is great because I've had this camera for a few weeks now, but the opportunities to shoot have been pretty sporadic because the weather in Salt Lake has just been crap. Because of those 3 days and getting to shoot so much on this camera, I've learned some really interesting things about the Q2. A lot of quirks, things that I don't like, things that were just weird to me, and things that I really do like. The first thing that I thought was really weird was simply the white balance. It didn't really seem to be very accurate. Whether I was shooting an auto white balance, which was kind of wacky, it just like jumped between too cool and too hot all the time. And then when I set the Kelvin, it seemed to be 1,000 to 1,500 degrees Kelvin, too cool all the time. There were plenty of shots that I set at 5,600 and I would have to raise all the way up to 7,500 in post to get it looking right. Now I will say, there is a setting in the camera where you can actually look through the EVF and set the color channel the way you think it should be and the LCD. And I did do that and it got it a little bit closer, but it still wasn't perfect. Again, this could be totally user error, but it was a source of friction. And it took me honestly like a day and a half to 2 days to kind of get used to that. Speaking of the EVF and the LCD, they're awesome. I loved using them. The LCD on the Q2 is fixed. It just stays there. You can't flip it out. But for me, that's not really a problem because this is how I like to shoot. I like to put it up to my eye and use the EVF. That's how I use this camera. I will say that shooting low is much tougher because of that, but I still managed. The clarity, the resolution, brightness on both the EVF and the LCD are amazing. So I really enjoy the screens on this camera. Probably the biggest difficulty and the thing I'm still trying to figure out is how to really properly expose this camera. From the experience that I've had, you cannot ETTR this camera. You cannot expose to the right. It tends to blow out highlights very quickly, and there's not much latitude in the highlights. Like once they've clipped, they're done. You really can't bring those down in post. They are a white hot mess. Other cameras that I've used have more flexibility in the highlights than this camera. Now that being said, if you underexpose this camera, then you can really take advantage of the dynamic range because the dynamic range through the shadows and the midtones is huge. There were shots that I took that I was like, wow, these are way too dark. Maybe a stop, 2 stops underexposed, and you could pull that back with no problems at all in Lightroom and they looked great. Once you've dialed in those things, there's no denying that the images are amazing. Now, Leica has a look. Everybody says Leica has a look. And I think for me, compared to the other cameras that I've shot on, the Leica look is a lot more contrast that you're probably used to and much more saturation in the colors. Now, this isn't necessarily my style, so it took a little longer in post than it normally would to kind of fix those things. But overall, when I actually nailed an exposure, nailed white balance, the images from this camera are awesome, and your ability to crop in is insane. Thank God, because 28 really is a little too wide for me. I think But there were times where I was like so far away and I could just keep cropping in and there was still so much detail to those photos. So really like the images that are coming out of this camera when I nail it. Is it fun? I don't know if I would call it fun. I think it's beautiful. And every time I pick it up and I look at it, it inspires me to go shoot. So that's a good thing. I don't know if I would call that fun. I'd say it's inspiring. The Fuji X100V, I don't really consider inspiring, but I consider it very fun because it's just like a little pull out of the pocket, boom, 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 get some great photos, post them to Instagram. It's fun. That's a fun camera. This is an inspiring camera. I don't think we talk about this enough on YouTube, but sometimes gear and certain brands can be looked at like status symbols. Like if you get a Leica or if you get a Red, you are now in a super special elite club and you feel special. It makes you feel special. Even though they're just tools, right? And one could argue that the price difference between an X100V and a Q2 just isn't worth it, even if it does come with that elite super special club. But here's the other thing, is that if I go back to the X100V and sell this Q2, and that's like me getting out of the club. It's like me going backwards, and in some way there's some internal pressure, maybe even some external pressure, that's like taboo, that's a no-no. Like you can't leave the club once you're in the club. It's kind of a weird thing to think about, but I could honestly use some advice. What would you do? Would you keep the Q2 and ditch the X100V? Or would you sell the X100V or sell the Q2 and keep the X100V? Or, shit, would you sell them both and buy something like an X-T5 and just buy two like prime lenses? I could honestly use some feedback. So down in the comments below, let me know what you would do. Well, that's it. Until the next one, that comparison. Catch you later. Peace.